Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about William Michael Rossetti's Preraphaelite Manifesto. The Preraphaelites were a mid-19th century arts movement, broadly conceived. A lot of them were painters, a lot of them were poets, some were literary critics, and then when you get to people like William Morris, who's kind of I don't know if I would say he's properly a Preraphaelite, but he's definitely influenced. He's a fellow traveler. And people like William Morris expand this much, much beyond what the Preraphaelite sort of core does, to include things like the arts and crafts movement, which was a furniture and home decor movement, printmaking, tapestries, wallpaper design, things like this. So they were actually a pretty pervasive and influential art movement. I'm not a huge fan of the Preraphaelites, in part because I feel like they're a less defined version of some movements that become more defined. So in some ways, the Preraphaelites are, for instance, precursors to Art Nouveau. A lot of the aesthetics of the Preraphaelites you get in Art Nouveau painting, but there's some distinct differences that make Art Nouveau a more clearly defined movement. Part of the reason that the Preraphaelites are a somewhat ill-defined movement is because they tried to blend what are probably conflicting influences. And Rossetti's Preraphaelite Manifesto gives us a sense of that. Like, he doesn't acknowledge them as conflicting influences, but we get a sense of this. So, the two of the big conflicting things that the Preraphaelites believed: one, they believed in realism. They believed that in painting and in writing, one has a responsibility to truth. So this is an idea that they pick up in a way from the Romantic movement of the generation before. People like Wordsworth, Keats, Byron, Shelley, Coleridge, etc., etc. These people were very committed to the idea of truth and freedom, and the Preraphaelites are as well. So that trend continues. But the Preraphaelites take a major interest in late medieval aesthetics. And actually, this is a thing, I'm a big fan of William Morris. So this is a thing William Morris carries forward. But the Preraphaelites, the reason they're called the Preraphaelites is because they identified Raphael, the late, I think 15th century primarily, Italian Renaissance painter. I'm not super sure on the dates of Italian Renaissance painters. But they identified Raphael, along with people like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, as where art went wrong. So they're really interested in 15th century Italian Renaissance art and its depiction. Because this is the sort of transition period where you go from medieval art, where everything is about religious subjects, to Renaissance art, which is much more influenced by the classics, by ancient Greece and Rome especially. That's where the Preraphaelites sort of break from Renaissance art. They're not big fans of the return to classical subject matter, classical poses, classical depictions, etc., etc. Even though a lot of Preraphaelite art, to my untrained as an artist eye, looks very similar to the kind of high Renaissance masterpieces, somewhat more realistically rendered, but the kind of high Renaissance masterpieces of people like Da Vinci and Raphael. Again, that probably says more about my limited ability to distinguish art movements. But the Preraphaelites But, so the thing that conflicted with the impulse toward realism was that they valued depictions of like biblical stories and medieval style aesthetics. Problem is, medieval art, medieval literature did not value realism. It simply wasn't a thing that they were at all concerned with. And so having those two forces kind of leads to a clash. And we do get a sense of this in Rossetti's Preraphaelite Manifesto, which I'm now finally going to turn to. This is a short manifesto, and based on the fact that in the Norton Anthology of English Literature, out of which I'm reading this, the title is listed in brackets, what that tells me is that Rossetti did not actually title this the Preraphaelite Manifesto. And in fact, what the Norton editors say at the beginning here is that Rossetti published his brother Dante Gabriel's letters in 1895. This account of the aesthetic principles of Preraphaelitism comes from the memoir he included in the first volume. So this is not a standalone manifesto in the way that like the Dadaist Manifesto or the Futurist Manifesto or something like this is. This is a discussion of what the Preraphaelites were about from a sort of retrospective collection published by somebody who was there and was part of the movement. So there's a couple of key things that this manifesto, such as it is, does. It starts out with establishing the broad goal of the Preraphaelites. What was it that they intended to do? And so what Rossetti starts out with here is, had the Preraphaelite Brotherhood any ulterior aim beyond that of producing good works of art? Yes and no. Assuredly, it had the aim of developing such ideas as are suited to the medium of fine art, and of bringing the arts of form into general unison with what is highest in other arts, especially poetry. Likewise, the aim of showing by contrast how threadbare were the pretensions of most painters of the day, and how incapable they were of constituting or developing any sort of school of art worthy of the name. So, again, this is really vaguely defined. And this was, I think, one of the things the Preraphaelites actually did somewhat consciously, at least. They did not nail down a specific aesthetic style that was required for Preraphaelitism because they did have different interests, different members of the group. Some were more interested in realism and depicting truth. Some were more interested in medievalism, etc., etc. So one of the things that you get is what I would call very vague and general descriptions of what the Preraphaelites are trying to do. Types of descriptions that, if I'm honest, can generally apply to most art movements who set themselves up in contrast to the mainstream. So it's very vague. The next point that Rossetti makes in this is that despite the fact that a lot of Preraphaelite art is really focused on religious subjects, they weren't necessarily a religious movement. There were critics, and possibly still today, because I mean, it's easy to look at their stuff and say, yeah, that's very Catholic or very high church Anglican. These sort of sumptuous depictions of religious figures and things like this. So according to William Michael Rossetti, at least, they were not. They were not a religious movement as such. Some of the members were religious, but they, as a group, appreciated the aesthetics of these religious, of this religious imagery. And that's what drove them to choose that subject matter more than faith as such. So that's actually a really important component for the Preraphaelites and for understanding them, because again, so much of their subject matter does depict biblical stories or other sort of church-related stuff. And so getting a sense of what the connections are and what the sort of religious ideology is actually kind of a useful thing to understand them more critically. And then finally, we have 4 goals listed in this manifesto. Number 1, to have genuine ideas to express. Number 2, to study nature attentively so as to know how to express them. Number 3, to sympathize with what is direct and serious and heartfelt in previous art to the exclusion of what is conventional and self-parading and learned by rote. And 4, and most indispensable of all, to produce thoroughly good pictures and statues. Now, as a manifesto goes, that kind of sucks. Sure, those are not bad goals, but they don't really mean anything at the end of the day. And this is one of the problems. And again, it's worth reiterating that this was not written and published as a manifesto. But it is an attempt to explain what the Preraphaelites were all about. And it doesn't. It doesn't. I mean, to say, to have genuine ideas to express, what does that mean? I mean, to suggest that people like Raphael, Michelangelo, and Da Vinci didn't have genuine ideas to express? It's kind of laughably insulting to those artists, who are some of the greatest artists in world history. Goal 4, to produce thoroughly good pictures and statues. How? By what metric? Good is one of the most vague and ill-defined criterion you can apply to art. The idea that something is good is incredibly subjective in art. Good at what? Good for what? From whose perspective is it good? So this is, I think, the problem I've always kind of had with the Preraphaelites, and why I've never really been a big fan, is that they're like, oh, our ideas make us distinct. We're doing something different. Don't ask us what exactly. And I recognize that that's probably an unfairly harsh critique of the Preraphaelites, but that's the way that I kind of see them. I see them as this sort of almost faux aesthetic rebellion. Like, sure, in some ways they challenged what mainstream artists were doing in mid-19th century Britain, but I also think they didn't challenge things as much as they maybe wanted to think they were. And I think there's later movements that come along, again, like the arts and crafts movement, the Art Nouveau movement, groups like this, that are much more aesthetically radical and much more coherent in what it is that they're doing and why.